So hi, my name is David Chu. I'm one of the, I'm an assistant program director in the Department of Medicine and in the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care. And today we're going to talk a little bit about trying to put all the stuff that we've talked about in some of the other talks, how to develop a plan, and for those of you who are interested, and I know this comes up a lot, how to think about like selecting a financial advisor and deciding if you really need one, depending on sort of what your needs are. So I always start these by saying I have no financial disclosures, and I always think that's really important. You always have to ask what are the motivations of someone giving talks on this stuff, because the vast majority of them are doing it because they want to make money at the end of the day and they want to get your business. I am not a financial advisor. I'm talking about all of this based on my own experience in reading, and so this is all purely sort of for education. I would strongly encourage you all to kind of do your own reading on this subject, but you just, similar to if you're reading a study, you want to know where their funding came from, right? You want to know why they're doing this. I do this because I think it's really important. I think it's something we don't talk about enough in the medical field, and sometimes people feel like it's a taboo subject, which it really shouldn't be. But I also admit that this is a line I get to put on my CV when I go out for promotion, and so that's helped to me in a career sort of way. But that's really all I kind of get out of this. So I think it's only fair that you understand where I'm standing. And again, when I talk about stuff here, you know, personal finance really is personal. Like we can talk about what the most optimal situation is given sort of talking about student loans or investing, and how to manage your money. But you know, it really depends on the specifics of your own situation, whether you're supporting a family on your own income, or if you're in a dual income situation. Whether you have like other loans that you're trying to deal with or not, like if you're trying to support other people, like these are all considerations that you have to take into account when you're deciding how to best sort of manage your finances. And so all of this should be taken in the context of like your own life and what your goals are. Planning your finances by definition is a very, very personal topic, because it's really you determining what your goals are and how to use the money you have to achieve them. As a reminder, you know, a lot of the talks that I've done before have been on student loans, insurance, protecting yourself against catastrophes, and retirement planning and investing. So I think these are kind of the big things that a lot of us in medicine have to think about. Student loans are kind of the big one that is maybe a little bit different, but I think the other topics are relevant to most people. And so hopefully that provides you with kind of a toolbox to start with and sort of an understanding of like some of those subjects. So I know we're not going to talk too much about it, just more about like, well, how do you fit all these things into your budget, right? So hopefully with those talks, you get the tools about here are the things you need to think about and how to go about purchasing insurance, dealing with your student loans, making a plan for investing for retirement, but how do you actually implement all of that? And that's what we're really going to focus on today. So, you know, I think the big thing here is that when you become an attending, your salary is going to go up. And I think a lot of people look at that number that's like 4 or 5 times or more of their resident salary and are like, okay, I'm going to buy myself a fancy car. I'm going to get like a super nice house. I'm going to send my kids to private school. Like I'm going to have the ability to kind of get all these things. I'm not going to have to really ever worry about money because I'm going to have more than I know what to do with. And the problem is that, you know, the more you kind of spend up front, the less you have to actually implement sort of other more specific goals. Like, you know, if you're spending $4,000 a month if you're spending like $2,000 a month on a ridiculous car payment, that's less money that you have to put towards student loans to pay them down faster or to save for retirement. Like you have to think about the effects of not only what's happening in the moment, but also like the downstream effects of if you're not putting money toward retirement earlier on, like that comes to bite you many, many years down the road. It's not something that you sort of get that immediate feedback on until you're like 20 years later on and you find that you're nowhere near sort of the goals that you need to meet. So you have to really think, I think, long and hard about what are the specific goals you want to achieve from a financial standpoint and prioritizing those before you start talking about like large purchases or anything like that, making sure that that would actually fit into your budget after you account for sort of the big things. I think it's important that when we talk about like how to develop a plan, that you also understand my perspective on it. And I'll admit, like in part, it was shaped by how my dad sort of viewed money, which I admit was very conservatively. And also books like this one, if you've heard of The Millionaire Next Door, I think the central theme here that, the way that you build wealth is by spending less. It's really not always just about making more money. That helps, but if you're just going to continue to spend up to however much you make, you're never actually going to grow your wealth. And so concepts like you're not what you wear, or you're not the car you drive, and that happiness really isn't derived by buying more things, but like spending intentionally. Like these are all things that I've taken to heart when I think about how to manage my finances. And so that colors sort of how I talk about all these things. And so again, I think that's really important to keep in mind as we talk about topics like this. So my values, I try to set very specific goals. Like I know that I would like to be financially independent within 10 to 15 years. And so with that in mind, it makes it very easy to start to run calculations about what will it take to achieve that. I tend to be very debt averse and pay cash whenever possible for things. I don't like taking out loans. However, from a pure number standpoint, given the high inflationary environment we are currently in, and if you can get a loan at a really low interest rate, you will come out ahead by taking out the loan rather than paying for something in cash up front. But personally, I really hate doing that. So I have a hard time doing it, even though I know the numbers work out. So again, these are things that are sort of personal decisions. My general tendency is to try to work hard now to reap the benefits later. I'm willing to delay gratification. I think anyone who's decided to take a career in medicine at least believes in that to some degree. But I'm willing to continue that a little bit longer to try to achieve some more aggressive goals in the long term. And then as I mentioned, I believe in spending intentionally, and all the data suggests that happiness comes from spending on experiences rather than just buying more stuff. So I tend to be more willing to spend on like a nice vacation with my family rather than just like, a nicer car that I drive every day or things like that. Like that's how I sort of think about the best way to utilize my money, is sort of maximizing the utility of it. Am I saying that I, follow this strictly? No, but again, this is sort of the place that I come from when I talk about subjects like how to plan your finances. And so again, important to know. So I'm not here to say that there's a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think it's a reasonable place to start for a lot of people, and you'll have to adjust it based on sort of the goals you want to achieve. So the first thing that you get to based on that is setting your goals, right? If you don't know what your goal is, how are you going to know if you're making progress toward it, how you're going to achieve it? The more specific you are, the more likely you are to be able to figure out if you're making progress toward it and that you actually would be successful at it. So the first thing is to really set the goals that you want to achieve. And then I do think there's a lot of value in writing this down somewhere. So when I've talked about investing, I often talk about an investing statement, like what is the strategy you're going to use? Just writing it down, because I think having it somewhere saying like, this is what I'm going to follow, and forcing yourself to like say, okay, if I'm going to make changes to this, I have to rewrite this. I have to do something, like adding that little bit of extra difficulty in terms of like making decisions like that, I think keeps you from sort of like changing just changing over time without thinking about it, that you have something to kind of reference over time and anchor to. So what do I mean by this? Some examples, like if you're talking about retirement, what time frame do you want to retire in? Is it 10 years? Is it 30 years? If you want to retire, like what do you mean by retirement? How much do you want to be able to spend each year? If you want to buy a house, what time frame do you want to buy that house in? What's your budget? Like getting very specific to this, because that's how you're going to get the information you need to run the numbers to figure out whether or not this is a reasonable plan or not. If you have student loans, when are you going to pay them off? How are you going to deal with them? If you have kids you want to support them through college, how much do you want to save for college? How much time do you have? That's all the information you need to be able to run the numbers and actually figure out what it's going to take to get there, rather than a more nebulous, well, I just want to retire in 30 years and I'm not sure how much I need, but I'm just going to save and hope that I get there. Well, if you can try to be specific about it, understanding that some of these numbers will evolve over time, that at least gives you a sense of whether you're checking along the way, whether or not you're on track. So specificity here is really key. Even if it's not perfect the first time, you can always go and revise it, but starting with something specific, again, makes it a lot easier to figure out, are you making progress towards your goal? So how do you actually implement this? I think that the real answer comes in making a budget. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use budgeting software and that you have to adhere to it strictly, but I think you have to get a sense in the beginning of whether everything you want to do and the goals you want to achieve actually fit within the budget that you actually have. Because if you don't start there, you end up in the situation that I find a lot of people are in, which is that at the end of the month, they're like, I don't have any money in my bank account to save. Like, I don't understand how I'm supposed to save for retirement. So my next question is, well, what's your budget? Where's your money going? And if you can't answer that question, then there's no way you're going to ever know how to save for retirement or how much money you have, because you've never really tracked it in any meaningful way. So here's here's sort of a starting budget, just to throw out sort of like what I think are the big things you need to think of. So we'll say as an attending, you're making $250,000 a year. After taxes and everything else, it comes out to about $15,000 a month, which is quite a bit, right? For many residents, that's like a quarter of their current salary, so a lot. So let's say, so you're going to want to start saving for retirement, right? The sooner you do that, the better, compound interest and everything. So we'll say you're going to save about 20% of it toward retirement each month. So that works out to a little over $4,000. If you have 200 grand in student loans, as I did when I started out, you're probably going to be making minimum payments of at least $2,100 a month toward that. You bought term life insurance because you have dependents. That's really cheap. That's only about 50 bucks. Disability insurance is going to be a lot more expensive though, maybe on the order of $400 or $500, depending on how much you got. You've decided not to buy a house, so you're renting, and you're renting a house for a family of 4. So we'll say it's $2,500 a month. And groceries for a family of 4 will say, okay, let's say it costs you $1,000. Hopefully it's a little less than that. Hope it might be more. It again depends on your situation. And then of course you're going to have to pay utilities. They're not included in your rent, so we'll say that's $350. Cell phone, electric, things like that. So your total left over after accounting for retirement savings, student loans, insurance, general living expenses is $4,340 a month. And so you've probably heard that analogy, the metaphor of the jar and the rocks, and that if you put the big rocks in first, you can get everything in there. But if you put the sand in first, you can't get the rocks in there. I think that is an apt metaphor for thinking about your budget. If you account for in your budget all the things that you know you have to account for and the things that are really important, like saving for retirement, your loans, all of that, and then figure out how much you actually have to spend on everything else afterwards, then it's a lot easier to figure out, like, can I afford taking on a car note? Can I afford that? Can I afford like a really large mortgage within my budget and still achieve the other things that I know I'm going to have to deal with, rather than the other way around, where you make the large purchase, you accrue all this debt, and you didn't take into account, well, I should be saving for retirement. I should be trying to pay off my student loans. So you have to account for the big things first in your budget before you really understand how much you have to work with. And so while that $15,000 looks like a lot, a good chunk is going to be taken out by saving for retirement and your loans. And so you have to account for all those big things first before you start talking about making any large purchases or taking on any additional debt. So do you know where your money goes? Because if the answer is no, you really need to, because that's the only way that you're going to, if you have any chance of figuring out, are you going to, where there's room in your budget to cut back on things to save more for retirement, or how do you sort of, how much you have in the way of resources, or like, if you don't understand why you don't have money at the end of the month, like, you have to know where it's going. There are really easy ways to do this. I use Mint personally, and just use most of my purchases are done through a credit card, also because of, purchase protection and credit and points and cashback stuff. So generally there's a lot of reasons to make purchases with credit rather than with cash, as long as you pay off the balance each month. But there are many other budgeting software and sort of tracking software out there, depending on sort of what you prefer. But using something that you can sort of use on a regular basis, that's sort of the key, is that it's something that you'll actually keep up with. Now, the general order of operations. So say you do have money left over and you're not immediately spending it on something, like, what do you do with this extra money? You've already accounted for retirement savings and everything else, right? So everything in that original budget. So I think if you have money that you're not sure of what to do with, the first thing is to make sure that you have an emergency fund. You're going to need ideally 3 to 6 months of expenses, so that, whenever they do surveys of like, can Americans afford a $400 emergency without going into debt? 40 to 50% of respondents to that survey say no. And I think no physician should ever be in that position. And I think, with the pandemic and everything else, a lot of people have learned the value of an emergency fund. So I feel like I don't have to point out this quite so much, but I still put it on there. Like, that's the first thing. You want to give yourself that buffer just in case those large expenses come up, so that you're not caught off guard, that you have a bit of a cushion. Then if you have retirement accounts with your employer and they offer a match, always put in enough to get that match. That is free money. I consider that as part of your salary. You just have to contribute to your retirement plan in order to get it. So if they're offering a 50% match, 100% match on your contributions, like, you always want to take it. There's no investment that you're going to make that's ever going to beat that. Then if you have really high interest debt, anything above 8% or above, that's got to go. That's really got to be a priority to get rid of, because there is no investment that you're going to be able to make that's going to consistently outpace that. Like, that is something that's just going to be a drag on your finances the longer it exists and it accumulates. So you've got to work on taking care of that as soon as possible. Then Roth IRA, most attending physicians, you're not going to be able to make direct contributions, and you're not going to be able to deduct traditional contributions to your IRA. So you're going to want to make a backdoor Roth contribution, which we've covered in prior talks. But if you're not familiar, it's very easy to look up. Basically, you make a non-deductible traditional contribution to your traditional IRA, and then you convert it to a Roth. And long story short, people used to be concerned that maybe this was going to be declared illegal, but as of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, this is officially legal to do. So that part has been taken away. And so it's extra tax advantage space, so you should use it. Then you go back to your 401k or 403b accounts, your other tax advantage accounts, and you fill those up. And then you have moderate interest loans. Now, could you make a decision around, debt that you have that's in the 4 to 8% range and say, I'd rather invest it rather than paying down my loans, or I'd rather pay down my loans rather than investing it? That's a bit of a personal decision and depends on how debt adverse you are. Given the general returns of the market over long periods of time, you will much of the time come out ahead. If your debt is in that range, by investing and just continuing to make the regular payments on your loans rather than paying off your loans faster. But again, this is where that whole personal finances, personal thing comes in. Maybe you're really debt averse, and having that additional debt just keeps you up at night, and you're just going to sleep a lot better if you get rid of it faster. That's okay. There's no problem with doing that. Like, at the end of the day, this has to be a plan that you can implement that you feel comfortable with. So if it makes you feel better to do it, I can't tell you that it's clearly wrong to do. Pay off your loans faster. That is always fine. And then finally, if you've made it up to that point and you still have money left over that you're not sure what to do with, that you don't have a specific plan for, that's where putting in a taxable brokerage account. Taxable just referring to a regular brokerage account that doesn't have any tax benefits, just investing it like with Charles Schwab or Vanguard or Fidelity or whatever, and just investing it so that it can also work for you. You should always be thinking about how you can make your money work for you and accrue additional money without you having to work, right? So that's sort of happening in the background without you having to take sort of active measures to continue to build your wealth. So, the one question I get a lot is, where should I keep my extra money? Like, people are like, well, if I put it in the market, then I'm going to be able to get much higher returns than if I put it in a high yield savings account. So I know I'm not going to need the money for a year. I want to get the higher returns in the market, so I'm going to just put it in a stock market account. Well, the problem is that, like, the market in any given year can it could go up a lot or it could go down a lot. So this is rolling returns of the S&P 500, the 500 largest stocks, so probably the index that one of the indices people are very familiar with, and is usually sort of the surrogate when we talk about like the US stock market and investing in it, like investing in an index fund. You can see that in any given year, the S&P 500 has returned either 60% increase in value or has decreased more than 40% in value. And, that graph I showed you was well before the beginning of this year, where the stock market has tanked 18, 19% in value since January. So I think people are a little less comfortable now, fortunately, trying to save their money in the market if they're going to be using it in the short term, because there's a real possibility that you lose a lot of value on that investment. The reason that you have to invest for the long term for retirement is, as you can see, when you get to the 15, 20-year range, there are basically no 20 or longer year periods where there's a negative return. That it sort of averages to, like, somewhere between like 6% per year to 18% per year for different 20-year periods. So in the long run, if your money's going to be there for a long time, you want to put it in the market. But if you're only going to be leaving it there for a year, 2 years, 5 years, and you want to make sure that you have it in that time frame, you're better off just putting it in a high yield savings account and just saying, like, look, I know I'm not going to get good returns on it, but I know it's also not going to lose value. So, and the other thing is that, like, if you're talking about like a 7 or 8% return per year, like, you're really not getting that much over a 2 or 3 year time frame. Like, you're not making that much more money in that time frame versus getting like 0.5%, 1%, whatever. So, like, you're taking on a lot of risk for not a lot of benefit. And so that's why my general advice usually is, for anything 5 years or less, if you think you're going to spend that money, just put it in a high yield savings account. If it's going to be 15 years or longer, then I would invest it. Okay. Another big thing that I recommend is don't grow into your income all at once. So as you saw from the example, like $250,000 a year ends up being $15,000 a month after taxes. So, like, even though the gross amount that you're being paid has gone up like 4 or 5 times, your actual take-home pay probably only went up like 3 at most. So it's not like it's a dramatic shift. It's large, to be fair, but it's not often like that dramatic. And the other thing is that, like, if you're still dealing with student loans, if you have like other large debt that you're trying to get rid of, like, you want to be careful about suddenly increasing your cost of living. You really want to make sure that you've dealt with the major things first while you're used to living like a resident, because it is so much easier to avoid inflating your lifestyle versus cutting back once you get used to having someone cut your grass or clean your house all the time or things like that. Like, once you're used to those things as a normal part of your life, you're going to have a much harder time taking those away, so you can then divert that money to something else. So the key is to try to not suddenly grow into your income. Now, am I saying that I lived an ascetic lifestyle like for the my first 4 years as an attending? No. So I think that there is certainly value in increasing your spending a little bit, but say like, 10 or 20%, that's still going to be a fair bit. You're still going to be able to do a lot more than you did as a resident, but this way it gives you a lot more in the way of monetary resources to deal with those big rocks that that you're going to have to deal with. The other thing is that delaying the time when you start investing matters a lot, because if you're talking about an average return of 7 or 8% per year, like, you can't make up time lost. So, if you start investing early in your career versus delaying 5 years, like, you have to save a lot more to get to where you need to be by losing those first 5 years. So you really want to make sure that you're prioritizing in saving for retirement, because those first few years as an attending have a really outsized effect on how much you end up with at the end of your career. And the other thing to keep track of is that, as you spend more, that number that you need to retire will go up as well. As a rule of thumb, if you expect for a 30-year retirement to be you can withdraw 4% from your total portfolio per year, well, that means that you need to save 25 times your annual spending to retire. So if your annual spending goes from $100,000 a year to $150,000 a year, that's 50,000 times 25 more that you're going to have to save in order to be able to retire. So another really strong reason that you really want to avoid sort of getting on the hedonic treadmill and just continuing to inflate your lifestyle, because the more you inflate your lifestyle, the more you spend, the further away you're pushing retirement, and the less, and paradoxically, and additionally, the less you're saving for retirement, which also means the further away you're pushing retirement. So all those things interact with each other. People also ask about home ownership. I have strong feelings about this. I can't say that this is totally that all of this is mainstream, but this is what I would recommend. I would generally recommend waiting a year, like when you take a new job, before you buy a house. you don't really know the group yet. You don't really know the area. You don't know that you're going to be staying there. All the statistics suggest that most physicians change jobs within the first 3 years of taking their first job. So, and if you buy a house, you're going to be stuck there for a bit, because if you want to actually guarantee that you're not going to have to sell the house at a loss, you generally need to own it 3 to 5 years, because recall that not only when you buy a house that there's the cost of the house to factor in, but you have to pay like a 4% commission on the way in and a 6% commission and fees on the way out. So like, not only do you have to hope that the house value goes up and not down, but you have to help it has to go up more than all the transaction fees that are also involved in order for you to walk away from that with being just even net even at the end of the day. So you have to be there for a bit to really reliably be able to do that. I would plan to try to put 20% down if at all possible. There are physician loans out there that will let you put down 5%, even 0%, and not have to pay private mortgage insurance. The downside to that is, in order to do that, they offer you a higher interest rate. So it's not without a downside, but it is something that you can potentially take advantage of if you're cash poor. But I would argue that you would be in a better spot if you just save up the down payment and are able to get a lower interest rate on your loan. And the other thing that people talk about, that renting is throwing away money, it absolutely is not. Like, everyone says like, oh, well, I can get the same place and pay a lower mortgage. Well, yeah, you should, because rent has to include things like maintenance and property taxes and insurance. So the mortgage on the same property should be less than the rent that you pay for a similar property, because the person who actually owns the property that you're renting from has to account for all of those things, in addition to the person making a profit off of the rent itself. So you can't sort of compare it, because there are all these additional costs that you have to factor in that you don't have to deal with as the renter. And then, as I kind of implied before, buying a fancy new car, I really push against this. Like, cars are depreciating assets. They are not an investment. If you have large student loans, you definitely don't need another loan payment. And, to the point where I mentioned before that, look, if you have a choice between taking out a loan at a really low interest rate in the high inflationary environment, are you going to come out ahead by investing that money? Yes, but that's only if you actually invest that money. I think in reality, most people just take the car loan, and instead of investing the difference, what they do with that money is they spend it on something else. And in that case, you're just paying an interest rate. You're not actually coming out ahead on anything. You have to actually invest the difference for it to make sense from a mathematical standpoint. And from a behavioral standpoint, I don't know that most people actually invest. Leasing, I really push people away from. It really only makes sense if you're going to buy a new car every 2 to 3 years otherwise, which I hope most people aren't planning to do. So most people, I think, should not be leasing. The problem right now is that, cars are really expensive. It's a bad time to kind of buy a car in general. And if you need a car, you're kind of stuck. But, you don't need a fancy car. You're not what you drive. Like, you have to decide for yourself what's most important to you. And if it's really, really important to you that you drive a fancy car, at least go into it with your eyes open about what the long-term costs of that are, and what you're having, and how that actually affects the rest of your budget. And then, as I alluded to before, spending intentionally, again, research shows that spending on experiences rather than buying more things is what tends to increase happiness. So think about, if you're going to spend on like different things, like, why are you doing it? Like, what do you get out of it? How does this improve your life? How are you buying more time? Are you buying help so you can spend more time with your family, or that, you're working long hours and you just don't want to think about something and you can fit it into your budget? I think that's very reasonable. I certainly do that. But I do that with the knowledge of like how that affects the rest of my budget. So, I'm not saying that you can't get, someone to clean your house periodically, or like someone to help like with lawn maintenance and things like that. But you have to understand how that affects your budget, if it fits in your budget, and making sure that it's not at the expense of other larger goals that you're trying to achieve. All right, so that's a lot. So I'll pause there for questions for a second. All right. So the next part of this really is going to focus on financial advisors. And, if you're talking about planning, like a lot of the stuff I think I was talking about before, and you're less familiar with it, or you just want someone to check your work, people are going to start talking about like, okay, well, I know these are the things I need to do. I would like some help in doing them. And so I would like to find a financial advisor that I can trust that's going to walk me through this, that's really going to have my best interests at heart. The problem is that like without doing any research on who you're working with, or too often, like what I find is people get referrals from other people, it's hard to know whether the person you're working with is going to be the next Bernie Madoff or not. So, if you're going to use a financial advisor, I think what I focus on is like the costs of doing so and understanding different cost structures and how they're paid, in addition to doing your research on the advisor themselves and making sure that they are a good fit for your needs and that they are reasonably trustworthy and should know what they're talking about. There's this quote that I love from Bill Bernstein. He's a former neurologist that turned financial guru. But basically, you're engaged in a life and death struggle with the financial services industry. If you act on the assumption that every broker, insurance salesman, and financial advisor you encounter is a hardened criminal, you will do just fine. So remember what I said at the top of the hour. I can't tell you how many times I have been approached as the program director for our fellowship about like, hey, I'm a financial advisor. I know your trainees ask a lot about this stuff. Like, I'd really like a chance to take them out to dinner and talk about it. And I always say no, because I really certainly don't want to put my stamp of approval on any advisor like selling their services. But like, the reason they're doing that is because, again, they have something to gain out of it. They're trying to gain your trust. They're trying to buy your business. And so you always have to keep in mind that that is their ultimate goal. Like, that is what drives them to do what they do. Now, with that in mind, why would you use a financial advisor? Well, I think that there are good reasons, and I understand that most people are not going to want to do this all on their own. I think it is possible, if you are willing to put in a little bit of work, to do so, and that the ongoing work on maintaining this really is not hard and takes me maybe like an hour or two a year at most. But I do understand, as I've tried to talk about this, that many people don't really want to go down that route, and that's okay. I think using a financial advisor then is in your best interest, but you need to ask about why. And so if you are interested in this, but you're like, hey, I'm new to this, I need someone to double check my work, that's very reasonable. You've done your reading, you're just looking for someone who does this for a living to just say, like, sign off on your work and just get their input, and you can decide what to do with that. This is something you don't want to spend time on. I know I'm weird. I know I like this stuff, and I know most people are not like that, and that's okay. So, I want people, if people want to spend less time on this, that's fine. This is not, however, using an advisor does not obviate you of the need to know about this. You still need to do some reading. You can't do zero reading on this and have them do everything for you. Another big thing, which has been supported in the data, is that they talk about how people who have advisors end up with a higher net worth than people who don't have advisors. I think a lot of that is born out of the fact that, like, a lot of people see the stock market tumble like it did earlier this year and sell at the bottom. And that's how you lose money investing. If you can actually hold on and not sell and continue to buy as the market goes down, that's how you make money. And I think having an advisor helping you manage that and coaching you through it the first time you deal with it and saying, like, don't sell, here's why, and you trust them, yes, you're going to end up with a higher net worth than the guy that sold at the bottom of the market. So that's another way that they can be helpful. And then one that I honestly have struggled with myself, I'll admit my wife really has no interest in this stuff. I've tried to teach her, she's just not interested, and I know that's, some people just don't want to do this. So even if you are motivated to do all this, to learn all this on your own, one of the worries that I have is whether, if I'm not around to help, how is she going to manage everything? Because she has some knowledge, but not a lot, and she's going to need some help. And if I can help select an advisor that I know will do right by her, who helps her implement a plan that I also had a hand in and I trust, and we have the same perspective on things, and I can feel a lot better in case something happens to me. So I think that that is a real consideration and a reason to consider a financial advisor, even if you do all of this on your own. So here are the big things I think you need to think about when you're talking about a financial advisor. First off, how are they paid? Like, you need to figure out what are their incentives when they talk about what things you should purchase and get involved in, so that you understand, is there any conflict of interest? What credentials should I be looking for? You know, similar to our profession, you wouldn't want to go to someone who hasn't had adequate training. As we'll talk about, the term financial advisor is kind of squishy, but there are certifications you can look for that you at least have some guarantee that they went through like a good amount of training and probably have some sense of knowing what they're talking about. How do you find a financial advisor? And then finally, how do you choose one? So talking about how financial advisors are paid, there are four main models: commissions, assets under management fee, an annual retainer, or an hourly rate or a flat fee model. So commissions are exactly what they sound like. That you don't pay them directly, you don't pay them a fee like to talk to them. You talk to them for free, but the way that they make money is by what they sell you, right? So it could be an actively managed mutual fund, it could be an insurance policy, but the things they're talking to you about and selling you are the things that are the way that they are going to make their money. So if you think about it, the incentive of these advisors is to sell you as many things as possible so they can really rake in those commissions, and to specifically have you buy products that are going to have the highest commissions. So if you talk to someone who says that they're an advisor and they say, oh, you don't have to pay me anything, let's just talk about this stuff, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because they likely get paid on commissions, and they're going to try to steer you toward things where they can really make a high commission off of you. So my general advice when it comes to this is keep your advice and purchases separate. I really don't advise people to have the person that is advising them on their finances also be the person that is the person they buy their insurance or from or anything like that. Too often I've had residents and fellows I've spoken to who say they have an advisor, and I ask what kind of insurance policies they have, and they tell me they have a whole life policy or a universal life policy. And I'm like, oh, who does your advisor work with? And they tell me it's Northwestern Mutual. I don't know why it's always them, but it always seems to be. And yeah, they're not an advisor, they're an insurance salesman. So, but they're acting like they're an advisor because there's really no regulation of the term. So again, be very, very careful. You really don't want to be working with an advisor that works on commissions. Their incentives are all screwed up compared to making sure that they're doing right by you. An assets under management fee means that you pay them a percentage of total holdings each year. So usually on the order of 0.3 to 2%, most commonly 1% per year. So what it means is that, so say they're managing your investments, then if you have $1,000 invested with them, usually more, they'll require a minimum. But if you had $1,000 invested with them, that would mean that year you would owe them $10, right, for their management of your money. Now, some interests align here, right? Like, so the more money that you have and the better it performs, the larger their cut, right? So if the whole pie grows, that percentage grows. And as I mentioned, they may require a minimum amount. You're not going to find someone who's willing to put in a few hours, put in the time if they're only going to get paid $10 a year, obviously. So they'll often say like, oh, well, we'll manage your assets if you have a minimum of 500,000 invested with me or $1 million invested with me or something like that. The problem is that when you do get to those larger numbers, you are certainly overpaying for their work. So as I alluded to before, like when it comes to managing my retirement accounts, like basically what it boils down to is I just have to rebalance to keep my allocation the same year to year. That takes me about an hour or two once a year. If you have, say, $2 million in assets and you're paying them a 1% management fee, you are paying them that you're $20,000 to do what probably takes them an hour or two. So you are certainly overpaying for the amount of work that they're doing at that point. The other thing is that you need to be careful about looking at that 1% fee and thinking about like, oh, this isn't that much, like it's not going to not add up. The thing is that it is, because you don't want to think of it as like it's as 1% out of your overall assets, but rather as a 1% less that you make on the return on your investment for a year. So say you made 8% on your investments and you're paying someone 1% per year to manage them, it actually works out to you making only 7% on your investments each year. So this is what that looks like. So say you're paying someone 1%, like advisor number 3, to manage your investments. You invest $40,000 a year, you get an annualized return of 7% per year. So your return after expenses is only 6% and you end up with 3.3 million. If you had managed it on your own and you didn't have an assets under management fee, you're going to end up with $700,000 more at the end of 30 years. The more you invest per year, the larger the return, the larger that difference grows. So you can see that all these like really small percentages really add up in the long term. And so you need to keep that in mind. If you're asking someone to manage your investments, many of them will request an assets under management fee, but you have to understand that if you're doing that, it is going to take a pretty large chunk out of the amount that you're going to end up with at the end of the day. So you have to decide for yourself whether that $700,000 difference or more is worth it. Another structure that advisors can get paid under is an annual retainer. So it's a flat fee structure that you're paying them on a regular basis. So like once a year, it can avoid conflicts of interest, right? You pay them, then at that point, like it doesn't matter what you buy or don't buy, like it doesn't change how much they make, right? So it's nice because now in theory, there's no conflict of interest in terms of, you know, what you purchase and how much money they make because you're paying them directly for their advice. The cost for advice doesn't change over time for an annual retainer. Usually it's $4,000 to $10,000 per year. And oftentimes to entice people to work with them, they'll have other services. So they may have a lawyer that works with them that you also get access to by paying this annual retainer. So I think, again, it's one of these fixed fee models that I tend to prefer, and it keeps your advices and purchases separate. But it depends on how much you need their advice. Like if you're only talking to them once or twice a year, you are certainly overpaying. So you really have to ask yourself with this model, like, are you actually going to take advantage of their services enough to make the fee worth it? The next one is an hourly rate or flat fee model. This is the one that if you can find it, I would really prefer because this is how you pay directly for the advice, but you also pay as little as possible for that advice because you're paying for the time spent for an advisor. With an advisor. So the rates are often $250 to $450 an hour. So it's not cheap, but you know, compared to paying $10,000 a year or more, you know, this is relatively cheap. So if you want good advice, you're going to have to pay for it. Like that's just always going to be true. And they'll have a minimum time. So they may say for like, you know, the first time you work with them that you have to pay for a minimum of 3 hours just to kind of make it worth their while, right? So the problem is you probably won't find that many advisors that work under this model because they'd make the least amount of money typically doing this, but this is the one where you don't have to pay as much and it's clear that your interests there's going to be less conflict of interest. So this is great for like a one-time meeting to set up a plan. Say you've read about this stuff, you want to manage it, but you want to get that double check. Like this is the kind of person you really want to go to. You pay your one-time fee. They're aware of your stuff. You don't really talk to them again unless there are questions or pay for their advice again, unless there are questions that come up down the line. And so you might, you know, meet with them once a year, once or twice a year, and you just pay for it each time you see them, and you know how much you're paying them, and you can track that, and you're not sort of paying them like more than you need to. The other terminology you may see is fee only versus fee based. Fee only means they only make money based on the advising fees that you are paying them. So if they say you're charging them $300 an hour, and they say they're fee only, then you can't purchase anything from them. This is the only way that they make their money from you. And so again, fewer conflict of interest. Fee-based means that they can make money from other sources like commissions in addition to advising fees. So if they say they're fee-based, you're going to pay them a fee for their advice, but you also likely have the option of buying things from them as well. And so they therefore would have potentially an conflict of interest in terms of selling you specific things to make a commission in addition to the money that you're paying them for their advice. You know, can there be good people who are fee-based and it just is more convenient for you? Yes. But you have to understand that like there is that inherent conflict of interest in that model. So I mentioned credentials earlier. So, you know, the term financial advisor, there's no legal standing, there's no specific background to do it. If you want to be able to sell things, like you have to take like basically 3 exams that just prove that you know what you're talking about when it comes to funds and stocks and options and things like that. It's not hard. I've looked into it. I almost did it just on a lark and I decided against it. Not worth it. So if someone's just saying they're a financial advisor, but they don't actually have any training or credentials behind it, like, what do you have to go on to know that they actually know what they're talking about? So I would really advise people against using a financial advisor that has no training, that has no like proof of training. Certified financial planner, or CFP, probably is the most common one that you'll come across. What it entails is 3 years of personal financial planning experience in the real world, working with a firm and completing coursework in a comprehensive exam. So you know that they've had a fair bit of experience, you know that they've had to do all this stuff to sort of get the certification. And so it at least tells you that they were willing to put in the time to learn their craft. There's also CHFC, which is a chartered financial consultant. This is more involved, 3 years of business experience, 27 semester hours of coursework, closed book exam, and they have to do continuing education, similar to what we do for CME, every 2 years. So this is a very good credential. You know that it's backed by the requirement to stay up to date on things and all of that. So again, I would certainly say that's a reasonable thing if someone has that as a credential, to say they probably know what they're talking about. And then the other one is CPA, PFS. CPA is a certified public accountant. Those are actually people you tend to go to for your taxes, but they can go for a personal financial specialist sub-certification and additional coursework after completing the CPA training, because really your CPA isn't there to be your advisor, they're usually there to be your accountant, but some of them do this additional training in personal finance to be able to provide advisory services. There's another one that's less relevant unless you have far more wealth than probably most physicians, like a chartered financial analyst, or CFA. This is usually for people that have like really, really large amounts of wealth in very, very specific situations. So probably the ones that you'd be looking for if you're looking for a financial advisor would be one of these 3 designations. How do you find them? Well, if you're looking for people who are fee-only advisors or fee-based advisors, the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors is the website you want to go to, napfa.org. And so you will find a listing of advisors. You can separate it out by, location and things like that. Although with the pandemic, I think we've all gotten used to using Zoom for a lot of things. Now realize that fee only does include the assets under management payment model as well, which is going to cost you more in the long run. But there are definitely ones on there that are annual retainer or hourly rate or flat fee based. And then if, while I think the white coat advisor more recently really doesn't have a whole lot to talk about because there just isn't a ton to talk about in this space sometime after a while, I do think that there is a lot of impetus on him to make sure that the people he recommends are people that are actually going to adhere to the policy of doing right by physicians, advising them to invest primarily in low-cost index funds and sort of doing sort of standard like advice, because it usually would get like pretty widely circulated if he advised someone that was paid on commission and really pushed someone into like whole life insurance and things like that. So it's another place to potentially look. They don't have to be local, as I mentioned before. If you want to do your due diligence on these, you can do a background check. All of this stuff is available. Form ADV, which is a required disclosure about everything related to the advisor's background in business. And so here's where you get into the nitty-gritty of how are fees charged, what's their compensation structure, any risk for clients. Interestingly, it includes any conflicts of interest. So say they're what's called a captive advisor, meaning they're employed by, say, Northwestern Mutual, and so they can only sell Northwestern Mutual products, like that will be listed on their Form ADV, and you may not discover that unless you decide to review that form. The other thing that's interesting is you can also see on there if they've ever been slapped with any disciplinary actions for doing bad things. So there, I think it's estimated that about 10 or 15% of advisors have had some type of disciplinary action against them. Well, that leaves 85 to 90% of them who haven't. So there's no real reason to go with one who has that on their record. And then there's the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website, which I put down there. Again, you can bring up a potential advisor's disciplinary history, their certifications, registration status, things like that. So how do you choose? Well, again, my recommendation in terms of payment model, you want an advisor that gets paid, that you pay as a fee only, and ideally a flat fee or hourly rate to try to make sure that you are paying only for the advice that you need at a reasonable rate. A real certification, CFP, Certified Financial Planner, CHFC, or an accountant, CFA, who's done the personal finance subspecialization. Are they good at answering questions and explaining concepts, right? So as I mentioned before, you're relying on this person for advice, not to do everything for you. And so when you talk to them, like, do they explain things well? Or do you find that they're easy to work with? Are they willing to sort of take the time to help you understand things? Because the answer is no, and they keep pushing to say like, look, I'll just take care of this for you. you don't really probably want to work with them. Like, they should be excited about teaching about this stuff. Like, this is their life's work, and hopefully that's something they're still excited about helping educate other people on. What's their investment philosophy? Are they a lifelong boglehead? Are they pushing you toward passive index mutual funds, telling you to do a reasonable split between US international stocks and bonds? Or are they like, look, I've got these really special funds that can beat the market routinely, and these are the only things that you should invest in. And yes, they have a 2% fee per year, but it's totally worth it. Like that, the latter is the kind of person you're going to want to steer clear from. And then who's your custodian? As I mentioned, some people are independent, but some people are captive advisors, meaning that they work for someone, they're only allowed to sell products from that company. You generally don't want to work with someone who isn't independent. And, you know, we're talking about someone that's going to be helping manage your money and have a pretty outsized effect on your finances. I would really recommend you take the time and interview multiple advisors and compare and find the one that works best for you and your purposes, and that you do your due diligence here, because no one else is going to make sure that your money's in the right hands. Like, you are the only one that really has your best interests at heart here. So it's worth it, if you're going to be handing over the reins to your money in any way to another person, that you are comfortable with doing so and you understand the consequences for doing so. The other thing about who to work with in the model to work under is, what do you actually need help with? So, for example, if you need advice on how do I figure out what to do with my student loans? How do I develop a retirement investing plan? Maybe you can implement it, but you just want someone to double check your work. Or you're like, I'm trying to figure out what to buy for insurance. What are my actual insurance needs? How much do I need? You might only need advice once, right? Like, you get the plan, you get the advice, and then you just implement it, right? Student loans, you have a plan, you do it, you're done. Insurance, you buy it, you're done. You don't need to continue to talk to an advisor about that in the long run. If you're comfortable with implementing your investing plan, like, you may just need someone to look over your work and make sure that it's reasonable. If you do want someone to manage your investments in the long term, okay, that's going to be ongoing, but it's going to be brief. It really does not take that much time to manage your investments. So going with someone you can sort of meet with on a once-a-year basis, who's willing to be paid on an hourly rate or a flat fee rate, is probably going to cost you the least in the long run, rather than going for an assets under management model. If you need help with your taxes, that's an accountant, CFA. If you need estate planning, like what trusts, wills, asset protection, like, you need someone with legal expertise. So you really are talking about an estate attorney or someone like that to make sure that things are set up correctly. So that's not a financial advisor, that's an attorney. So that's different. So, you know, I think there's a spectrum when it comes to choosing a financial advisor. So you could there are the people like me who are like, you do it yourself. And then there are people who really want someone to help them all along the way. Now, I did want to talk briefly about this, which is sort of the rise of robo-advisors, which kind of falls sort of in between, more on the DIY side, but basically you didn't want to manage your investments year to year. So what are robo-advisors? Basically, you open an account with them, and you give them your money, you give them information about your investing philosophy, or just information about your risk tolerance, and you open an account with them. So they can generally manage IRAs or taxable brokerage accounts. They generally can't manage workplace plans. So if you have a 401k, 403b with your employer, they aren't going to be able to manage that. But that's also similar to a regular financial advisor, where they can directly manage IRAs and brokerage accounts, but they will give you advice on what to do with your 401k or 403b. They invest your money based on their proprietary algorithm and periodically rebalance it for you. Some of them can do automatic tax loss harvesting or other tax optimizations based on your individual situation. And then you pay them an assets under management fee. But since it's run by algorithm rather than a person, they charge a lot lower. So it often is on the order of like 0.3% per year rather than 1% per year. And you'll sometimes get access to online tools and calculators, although I would argue the vast majority of the ones they offer, you can often find versions of for free by just doing a search on Google. So really the benefit here is that they're managing your investments for you. If you really don't want to do that, you don't want to deal with rebalancing, you don't want to have to select your allocation and adjust it over time, that's where this potentially becomes helpful. And so to give you a sense of what the assets under management fees are for these different companies, Wealthfront's 0.25, Betterment, Ellevest, Vanguard recently opened one at 0.15, And you can see the account minimums here are pretty low because, it doesn't require them to do a lot of work. So they're willing to not be paid a whole lot in the beginning to get your business in the upfront so that they can continue to make money off of you as your account balances grow. So the pros are it's hands-off investing. You don't have to do anything. You just put your money into it. They invest it based on their algorithm. Most of these are going to be based on a general consensus of like passive index investing. So it's not like they're doing anything funky most of the time. And it's much lower fees than a full financial advisor doing it for you. The cons are, again, they can't handle all of your accounts because most people will be using workplace accounts to some degree. You have to trust their algorithm and investment choices. So they're going to throw their own special sauce in there to try to, beat the market or do something different. And you have to believe that they're doing the right thing by doing that. And that's not always true. So just be aware that, again, you're putting your money in someone else's hands. And honestly, a lot of this, if you just wanted a hands-off way of investing, you could just put all your money in a target date fund, which will balance it across like a US market, total market, an international total market, and a total bond market fund, and rebalance it for you. And you don't have to do a thing. And you can pay an expense ratio of like 0.1 per year. So I don't know that there's a whole lot of benefit above just using a target date fund if you use a robo-advisor, other than maybe some of the tax optimization stuff. So here's sort of the take home for that. If you're thinking about using an advisor, the first thing I always recommend thinking about is what is the advice you're actually looking for? Like how long do you need them? Do you really need ongoing advice? Do you really need someone to sort of do stuff for you in perpetuity? Or is it just a one-time check-in? You're just trying to get some questions answered and then you'll call it a day. If you're going to use an advisor, choose one that's paid by a flat fee or hourly rate, ideally a fee-only advisor if you can, to again, avoid those conflicts of interest. If you truly want hands-off investing, you could use a robo-advisor, but again, I don't think robo-advisors add a whole lot of benefit for most people versus using a target date fund, except for maybe some tax optimization on the taxable account side. And remember that advising fees are in addition to fees on investments. So what I mean by that is if you're paying your advisor 0.3% per year to manage your investments, and they're investing in something that has an expense ratio of 0.3% per year, your actual total fees for each year is 0.6%, which means you have to subtract 0.6% from your annualized return to see that's the actual return that you're going to make. So if they're choosing to invest in things that have high expense ratios, you're kind of getting hit twice with fees, and you're going to really end up behind. So you really want to make sure that they're investing in appropriate things that have low costs. So you still need to understand what they're doing. Using an advisor does not obviate you of the need of knowing something about investing and retirement and all this stuff. Like, you should come to the table with an idea, not do this for me. And at the bare minimum, they should be able to explain why they're doing it and help you understand why they're doing what they're doing. So what I would say is, I think most people, you can start, if you've never done this before, just write down 2 or 3 financial goals and figure out where you're starting from. What are you spending on? Like, what's your current net worth? Just add it up, just know where you're starting from. And that gives you your jumping off point when you're trying to develop this. Look at your monthly spending, project like when you become an attending, like what is your budget going to look like? How much do you want to start saving for retirement? How do you fit all of this into a plan that is really workable? And if you think you need an advisor, determine what questions you're actually going to have for them. What are the specific reasons you're looking for an advisor, and make sure you're choosing one that isn't going to charge you through the nose or provide really bad advice and be incentivized to do so. The other thing is that, I like this quote in addition to, Rome wasn't built in a day and there are many roads, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that like, as long as you're saving enough and you have a reasonable investing strategy, you're going to do just fine. There's not one correct answer to this. And honestly, like, saving a lot overcomes a lot of mistakes. So as long as you don't make the big mistakes, particularly in the beginning, those first few years as an attending, you can kind of make it up. So, reading about this, working on this, and making the small mistakes now is great, because then you're prepared when you're an attending to sort of do the right thing. You're used to doing this, you have some knowledge of it, and you're not going to you can at least avoid the big mistakes, taking on a lot of debt at the beginning of your career, not saving enough at the beginning of your career, and making sure that you position yourself sort of in a good spot, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line. All right. And with that, I'll take any additional questions.